I'm reading a letter dated March 1917, written in pencil on paper so thin it nearly tears in my hands. The handwriting is careful, deliberate, each word chosen to bridge an impossible distance. This is Edward Reeves writing to his wife from somewhere in France, and this letter is one thread in a story that spans continents. Edward Reeves was an ANZAC, Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, one of thousands who sailed halfway around the world. The ANZAC identity was forged in shared hardship, men from farms and cities bound by mateship and a quiet, stubborn courage. Edward was 24 when he enlisted, a shearer from rural New South Wales, and in his letters he never called himself a hero. What's fascinating is how these letters reveal not grand strategy or famous battles, but the small human details. He writes about the men in his platoon, Bluey, who could make anyone laugh, Tomo, who carried a photo of his dog, Smithy, who sang off-key every morning. While Edward fought, his wife Margaret waited. Her letters arrived months late, carried across oceans by ships that dodged submarines. She wrote about the vegetable garden, about rationing sugar and flour, about the silence in their empty house. What I realized reading her words is that she was fighting her own war, against fear, against not knowing. The distance between them was more than geographic. Edward couldn't describe what he saw without breaking her heart. Edward's early letters describe the trenches with a kind of dark humor. He writes about rats the size of cats. The Western Front was a maze of mud and barbed wire stretching hundreds of miles, and the ANZAC units rotated through sectors. The routine was punctuated by random violence, a sniper's bullet, a shell landing without warning. What strikes me is how quickly the extraordinary became ordinary. Edward writes about a bombardment that lasted 6 hours as if he's describing bad weather. He mentions that Bluey was wounded, copped one in the shoulder, lucky bastard gets to go to hospital, and moves on to complain about the quality of the tea. This wasn't callousness, it was the only way to function. If you stopped to feel everything, you'd never move again. In April 1917, Edward's letters stop for 6 weeks. When they resume, his handwriting has changed, shakier, less certain. What happened in that gap was a gas attack. He describes it in fragments, the lookout shouting, the yellow-green cloud rolling low, the scramble for masks, the burning in his throat and eyes. Gas didn't kill cleanly, it drowned you from the inside. Edward got his mask on in time, but he breathed enough to damage his lungs and spend weeks in a field hospital coughing blood. The reason gas was so terrifying wasn't just the physical damage, it was the invisibility, the helplessness. By the time he was well enough to write, Tomo and Smithy were dead. He doesn't say how he feels about that. He just says they're gone, and the silence around those words is louder than anything. Edward spent May and June 1917 in a hospital near the coast. His letters from this period are different, longer, more introspective. He writes about lying in bed, listening to the sea, about the strange guilt of being safe, while his mates were still in the line. He'd been promoted to corporal before the gas attack, and now he worried about the men under his command. The weight of leadership never left him, even when he was too weak to stand. He also writes about the other men in the ward, blinded, missing limbs, lungs ruined like his. He describes a boy from Queensland who'd lost both legs and still joked about beating everyone in a foot race. Edward writes, "We're all broken in some way now, but we're still here, and that counts for something." That sentence stayed with me. Edward never asked to be corporal. The promotion came after his sergeant was killed, and suddenly he was responsible for 12 men. In his letters he writes about the impossible choices, who to send on patrol, how to keep morale up when rations were short, how to write to the families of men who died under his watch. The ANZAC spirit was built on mateship, and mateship meant you carried each other's weight. Edward writes, "I dream about their faces, every single one. I don't think that will ever stop." There's a stretch in mid-1918 where Edward's letters become sparse, mechanical. He describes the weather, the food, nothing else. Margaret writes back asking if he's all right, and he doesn't answer the question. What I realized is that these were the darkest days, not the battles or the gas, but the grinding exhaustion of wondering if any of it mattered. Edward writes in August, "I'm so tired, Maggie, tired in my bones. But the lads need me, so I keep going." That's not heroism in the way we usually talk about it. That's something quieter and harder. On November 11th, 1918, the guns stopped. Edward's letter from that day is only 3 sentences. "It's over. I can't believe it. I don't know what to feel." The armistice didn't bring instant relief. It brought a strange, hollow silence, and the realization that surviving meant going home to a world that had moved on without you. Edward writes about men weeping, about others sitting in stunned quiet, about the disbelief that they might actually live through this. By December, Edward was on a troopship bound for Australia. He writes about the voyage, the cramped quarters, the men who couldn't sleep, the ones who stared at the horizon for hours. He writes about survivors' guilt, about the faces he'd never see again, about wondering if Margaret would recognize the man coming home. The war had ended, but Edward was still carrying it. The ship was full of men like him, physically alive but haunted, sailing toward a future they weren't sure they deserved. Edward arrived in Sydney in January 1919. Margaret was waiting on the dock, and he almost didn't recognize her. Not because she'd changed, but because he had. His final letter, written the night before he landed, says, "I don't know if I'm the man you married anymore. I hope you can love whoever I've become." They stood on the dock for a long moment, and then she took his hand. No grand speeches, no cinematic embrace, just 2 people trying to find each other again across an unbridgeable distance. Edward lived another 40 years. He never talked about the war except in fragments late at night when the nightmares woke him. But he and Margaret rebuilt a life, one small, deliberate choice at a time. That's the real story, not the battles, but what comes after. War-torn letters are fragile things. Paper and ink shouldn't survive a century, but they do because someone kept them, because someone thought they mattered. Edward and Margaret's letters matter because they show us that war isn't about strategy or politics. It's about people trying to hold on to their humanity. I'm grateful these letters exist. I'm grateful Edward made it home, and I hope 100 years later we remember not just that they fought, but that they loved and hoped and survived.